Good morning. Welcome to the UPHS 2016 webinar series. This is Ellen Kakalkevich, Executive Director of United Partners for Human Services. All of our webinars in this series will be posted to the UPHS website after the live event at uphsfl.org. Since you are participating in the live webinar, you will be able to engage in the Q&A portion and also an activity during the PowerPoint presentation. Simply type in your question and we will respond during the Q&A portion. Today's webinar is Making the Most of Multi-Generational Communication. Our instructor is Trish Yahn, Certified Workforce Development Professional, Executive Center Manager for CareerSource Capital Region. We have another webinar coming up on Wednesday, September 20th, which is the Power of Thank You. And you should have received registration information, but if you need the link, it's here, and you can copy it down. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that if you haven't received an email about that webinar, Power of Thank You. So again, with this, I hand it over to Trish Yahn, Making the Most of Multi-Generational Communication.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Making the Most of the Multi-Generational Workforce and Multi-Generational Communication. So everyone has different generations in their workforce. No workforce is homogeneous. And today we're going to look at understanding the 5 generations, up to 5, that are currently in the workforce. What values and personality traits do each of those generations possess? And then we'll talk a little bit about identifying strategies for working with and communicating with the multi-generational workplace and teams. I want to start off by letting you take a look at this chart and let me know what generation you think you are. Feel free to type into the question box or just in your mind decide which generation you are. Now, please note that the date range can vary, plus or minus 4 years for each of these generations listed. It's more important for you to identify with the generation that you share personality traits and core values with, more so than the years represented. So the 5 generations we're going to talk about today are the Traditionalist or mature generation, Baby Boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, who are also known as the Millennial generation, and then the newest generation that you may have in your workforce, which is Generation Z or the iGen. The I stands for the Internet generation. So each generation that enters the workforce has different attributes than the generation before. And there's always potential for misunderstanding and conflict when generations interact, but there's also the potential to work together in ways that create better outcomes than any one generation could achieve on its own. Having different generations in the workplace is part of having a diverse workforce. Having a better understanding of others, whether they're from a different generation, a different culture, or any other difference, can make the working environment much more productive. So as I said, the workplace really is now multi-generational, and each generation tends to communicate a little bit differently. Let's talk a little bit about what a generation is. It consists mostly of people born in roughly a 15 to 20-year span who share a distinct set of beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors because of the events that occurred in their lifetime. Generational timelines are getting shorter, however. For example, the Traditionalist generation covers a 20-year time span, Baby Boomers 18 years, Gen X is only 15, Millennials is down to a mere 13 years. We're not quite sure where the cutoff is for Gen Z or what the next generation will be called. We're kind of at the end of the alphabet here, so who knows, maybe we'll start over with A or come up with a new name. We're going to discuss each of the generation's values, communication preference, organization style, and strengths, which will hopefully help you better relate to the generations different from your own. Please keep in mind there's not one set of criteria that can fully define a person, but understanding factors can shed light on a person's perspective. Understanding how and why people approach situations differently can be a great help in resolving conflicts and creating win-win situations. So let's look at some of the attributes of each generation, and later on we'll discuss how to use that information to best work with or for different generations. Now, there are fewer and fewer traditionalists in the workplace. You can see their birth years are 1925 to 1945, but they are still here. Often they are the leaders of organizations, but many traditionalists have returned to the workforce either for financial reasons or just to keep busy. For example, my dad is a traditionalist. He's 86 years old, and he retired but went back to work because sitting at home was not an option for him. So for some people, traditionalists may be our parents, for others our grandparents, and for many traditionalists are now great parents, especially great grandparents, especially to Gen Z. They're also called the silent generation or the veterans. The most defining moment for them was the Great Depression. Some of their core values, they believe that if you work hard, then you'll be rewarded. College degrees and postgraduate degrees were a privilege for this generation. Many went right from high school into the work world. Traditionalists grew up in a time when a handshake was as legitimate as a contract, so their word is their bond. The waste not, want not, you can relate that to the Great Depression. They tend to have conservative views of family, faith, and country. Traditionalists also lean toward formality and have a propensity to adhere to accepted standards. They don't like to shake things up. Baby boomers, also just called boomers, they had a lot of defining moments. This is my generation. Some of those defining moments were the JFK assassination, sexual revolution, civil rights, the American dream, Vietnam, and the moon landing. They joined the workforce with high ambitions. They were able to achieve a higher standard of living than previous generations. They did and still do this by working hard, putting in long hours, and reaping the rewards of their hard work. The boomer generation is the most educated of all generations so far. They viewed education as a means to an end to progress in their careers. Boomers really did grow up in a time of turmoil, from the Vietnam War, the Kent State shootings, the civil rights and the women's liberation movements, to the assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The younger group of boomers relate to Watergate, gasoline shortages, and the Iran hostage crisis. As a result of all this turmoil, many boomers started their professional lives distrusting people in authority. Now they tend to be the people in authority roles. Boomers don't like rules for the sake of having rules, but they do thrive where there is structure and a plan in place. They're often very competitive, but also great team players. Because they believe that hard work should pay off, boomers expect to be recognized for their hard work. Simple courtesy, using please and thank you, can go a long way in gaining their respect. Generation X, also called the baby busters or Gen Xers. Their defining moments were the Challenger disaster, divorce, the Berlin Wall falling, and latchkey kids, those kids who came home after school with a key around their neck because their parents were working. Gen Xers are hard workers, but they'd rather find more efficient ways to get things done. They prefer to self-manage and usually are not the best team players. Because of this, Xers will often create their own jobs. They're very entrepreneurial. They value education, but they don't see it as a means to an end like the boomer generation did. They don't believe in get a degree and get your dream job. Technology changes happened quickly when the Gen Xers were coming. They were heavily affected by the economic downturn following 9/11, and they were the first to face rampant divorce rates among their parents and often grew up as latchkey kids, so the traditional family structure was also changed. Gen Xers can also be called the prove-it generation. They're very slow to trust, especially people in authority, and they want facts to back up decisions. Let them know what's going on and, more importantly, why decisions are being made, and they're much more likely to buy in. They value time away from work and believe they should be able to work from anywhere. Technology plays a big part in this. If they can work from home via technology, they'll often prefer doing this and will be just as productive as if they were in a brick-and-mortar office. They work to live versus boomers who live to work. So Generation Y, or the millennials, they're also called the echo boomers. Their most defining moments were the 9/11 attacks, Y2K, school shootings, and social media. Millennials grew up in a world where technology provides instant access and interaction. They have an entrepreneurial spirit, and according to some surveys, less than 15% of millennials dream of climbing the corporate ladder. They want to make their own job. They believe in following their passion. They want to make a change in their world and embrace causes that allow them to do that. Often their work is tied to a cause that they're passionate about. They are team-oriented, but they don't want to be held to an 8-to-5 schedule. There's a misconception about millennials that they are kind of slackers, but quite honestly, they're very high-performing and very hard workers. They just have to believe in what they're working for. So the youngest generation that's just now entering the workforce is Gen Z. They were born from 1996 through now. They're also known as the Internet generation. Their defining moments is all technology, all the time, and the Great Recession. This generation is still evolving. Its oldest members are just reaching 20 years old, and they have always lived in a digital world. Gen Z so far appears to be even more entrepreneurial than Gen Y. They believe that being highly educated will lead to good paying jobs and career success, and they are driven by honesty. It's what the majority of Gen Zers entering the workplace expect and even look for in their leaders. And contrary to what a lot of people believe, even though they are an internet generation, they really do prefer face-to-face contact, and they want to be included. So I want to do a quick activity, if you would, in the question box. Think about some of the generations that you have worked with other than your own, and name one trait you appreciate about a generation other than yours. How has that trait influenced you in a previous job? So the work ethic of the boomers is a trait that someone appreciates. Anyone else have an appreciation of a trait of a generation other than your own? I know for me, I appreciate the traditionalist, the mature, because their word is their bond. They believe in being on time for things. They believe that if you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it. And I feel like I have incorporated some of those traits into my own work ethic as well. Yeah, social media and technology oriented is something someone else appreciates from the younger generations. We can all, the older of us on this webinar, can certainly appreciate how the younger generation takes those things for granted, and we maybe need to work a little harder at it. Okay, thank you so much for participating. One of the things that can get lost in the generational translation is when we don't always communicate in the same way. So if, for example, even if you have the best of intentions, there can be a failure to communicate because one generation may not be aware of the different generational perspectives. So my example that you see here is a millennial employee sending a text message to her traditionalist boss telling him she'll be late for work. Once that boss finally figures out what the message means and then fumes because the employee didn't call in person and apparently doesn't know how business communication should be written, then he starts really wondering, what is this person doing working in my organization? His perception is that the employee is showing a lack of respect and unprofessional behavior and seems to make it very clear to the employee when they finally arrive at work. On the other hand, the millennial thinks that she's done the right thing by notifying her boss that she'll be late, and she doesn't understand why she's in hot water. We need to seek first to be understood, seek first to understand, then be understood, which is one of the 7 habits of highly successful people from Stephen Covey. Because ultimately, understanding and using the preferred method of communication for the person with whom you're communicating makes things run more smoothly, with less conflict and less misunderstanding. So we're going to talk about some tips for how to communicate with some of the different generations. Please keep in mind that not everyone who falls into a generation's age bracket is going to prefer those methods of communications. You still need to get to know the individuals with whom you're working. Traditionalists want face-to-face or written correspondence. They don't want to waste time. They want you to get right to the point. The boomers want you to be open, direct, and present options. They want to know that you're flexible. You want to answer questions thoroughly and provide details. A key to that is listening to what the question is, answering the question that was asked, and not kind of going off on your own tangent. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that one generation should not have to accommodate the preference of other generations all the time. We all need to work together and determine a way to communicate that works for everyone. If there's a clear expectation from the organization for the preferred method of communicating, each generation does have to adapt to that method. So for Generation X, they really want you to share information regularly. They want to be kept in the loop. They want to be a part of the process. So ask for their feedback. They're much more likely to buy in if they are a part of the process. They prefer informal communication. Email is a preferred method. They don't want formal memos and letters. They just want you to let them know what's going on and ask them for their input. The millennials also want their input to be included in the communication. They want open communication that welcomes their ideas. Do use email. Write in active voice. Be clear, be concise. Use action words to challenge their thinking. Remember, we're still learning about Generation Z because they are the youngest generation that you may or may not have in your workforce. But because they always grew up, they always had technology in their world, they expect a rapid response. Don't talk down to them, treat them like adults. In this day of text messaging, instant messaging, the younger generation expects and usually gives very quick responses to their communication. So let's spend a few minutes talking about how we can be successful when we're working with other generations. Each generation has knowledge to offer and can teach lessons to the other generations. For example, traditionalists and boomers know a lot of the tricks of the trade that younger workers may not know and need. Gen X employees are known for their fairness, and they're often great mediators. Millennials are technology wizards, and the Gen Z folks can provide unique insight into marketing and business trends. If you want to know what's coming up and what's happening in the world, ask a Gen Zer. because they probably have a good idea of what you should be marketing and what audience you should be targeting. Remember, how you treat someone, even if it's subconsciously, is a reflection on you, not a reflection on them. Just because someone is younger than you doesn't mean they don't know anything. Someone who's older than you isn't necessarily a dinosaur who doesn't understand technology. You have to be willing to try new approaches and consider new ideas. Socializing outside of work is a great way to build stronger relationships. Group events that include everyone from your organization, where people really just get to know each other on a personal level, can really help you understand the different generations in your workforce. And don't forget the power of social media in connections as well. Traditionalists and boomers are also using Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. It's not just something that's out there for the younger generations to use. Try connecting with the people that you work with. An important thing, especially for an older person working for a younger person, is to avoid mentioning to your younger boss similarities between them and your adult child, or talking about what you did at your age. That's not going to build trust and respect with your younger boss. When you're working with or for people from generations, you want to get input from each demographic. You want to take everyone's opinion into consideration. Work together to share information, to provide feedback, and to brainstorm ideas and solutions. Don't act old. This is something that boomers and traditionalists sometimes do without even noticing. Complaining about your aching back, talking about how things used to be done, or habitually mentioning your age can make you seem dated and unfit for the position that you hold. I do see some questions, and we will get to the questions later on in the presentation, so if you would just hold on to those, I'll get to you. So let's talk a little bit about what's similar in each generation. Every generation has similar values. We're all different, but we all share some of the same things. For example, integrity, achievement, competence, and responsibilities are values that are found in each generation. Everyone wants to be respected, and most everyone respects others. What may be different between each generation is how respect is defined. For example, a boomer may feel that the millennial is being disrespectful by using their cell phone in a meeting, but the millennial just sees it as multitasking and getting even more done. All generations need to trust one another. By and large, people trust the people they work with directly more than the organization, and trust the organization more than they trust upper management. I'm going to read that one to you again. People trust the people they work with people trust the people they work with directly more than they trust the organization, and trust the organization more than they trust upper management. That's usually something that people need to think about for a minute. And that's something that often invites questions. People of all generations want their leaders to be credible and trustworthy. They want them to listen well, and they want them to encourage them. All generations have a need to learn. They want to have the training they need to get their job done well, and they're interested in what they need to be learning to advance within the organization. So what do you need to do to learn from each other, to communicate better, and to have a more cohesive workplace? You need to understand that each generation has valuable lessons to teach the next, or the one before, or even the one before that. Traditionalists and boomers have all this knowledge, tricks of the trade. Generation X employees are very much known for their fairness and mediation abilities. Gen Y and Gen Z are the technology wizards, and Gen Z holds clues to future workplace, marketing, and business trends. What you really should do is consider mentoring both in the traditional sense, where a seasoned employee mentors a junior employee, or even reverse mentoring, where the younger staff members mentor the more experienced staff. There's always something to be learned from one another. Remember, every generation has its own attitude towards work. Just because a generation has a different attitude than your own doesn't mean it's a bad attitude. Generations have more in common than they have differences. Recognizing those differences make the workplace more productive. No one wants to work in a homogeneous workplace. We have to have diversity to have new thought and new ideas, and it just makes for a better place to work. And we can all learn from each other by having respect for our differences. What I'd really like to spend some time doing right now is getting your input and what you think. We do have some questions that I want to address. I have one. My son is Gen Z, born in '96, but his sister is a millennial born in '94. Are they really that different? Probably not. Remember that the year span is really just a guideline, and that there's no one set of years that can define a person. What you grow up with, what is going on in the world around you defines more about which generation you identify with than the year that you were born. Is it okay to tell younger generations about speaking, communicating, and dressing appropriately, or is this just old-fashioned? Absolutely, it's okay. One of the things that needs to be made clear, especially in the workplace, is what are the expectations from the organization. If the organization has clearly defined methods of communicating or dress code or how you speak with and to other people, this needs to be communicated to everyone, not just the younger generation. It needs to be consistent for the entire workforce or the entire organization. The next question is, shouldn't employees adapt to the communication style of the boss? Usually I would say that's true, but sometimes, again, you're going to go back to what's the preferred communication method of the organization. So for example, I am, as I said earlier, I'm a boomer, and I have someone who is younger than me who reports to me, someone who is my generation who reports to me, and I have a traditionalist who reports to me. And what I've done with my staff is I have said, what are your preferred communication methods? Because the boss isn't always right, even though maybe they're supposed to be, but they're not. So adapting to what works for everyone is probably the best way to deal with communication. And it really should be more important that everyone is getting the message versus how the message is being delivered. So what are the strategies to work with Gen Z and millennials? Probably the biggest thing I can tell you about working with those two generations is don't talk down to them. Include them as much as you can in what's going on within the organization. Include them in the decision making. You don't want to be seen as that person who says, oh, those kids, they don't know anything. Because if you think about it, when you were new to the workforce and you were younger, the generation before you probably said the same thing about you. So with the Gen Zs and the millennials, treat them like adults because they are. Include them as much as you can and be open to learning new things from them. Are the younger generations open to mentoring? Yeah, they sure are. We have a millennial in our office, and she is kind of like a sponge. She really wants to learn new things. She wants people to teach her what they've learned through their career. She's putting her own spin on it, but they're very much open to being mentoring. The method that you use to mentor may need to be adapted to their learning style. These millennials and Gen Z in particular, they grew up in this technology era, so they want things to happen pretty quickly. They're used to things happening quickly. But just be open, honest with them, let them know what you have to offer, and reverse that and see what they have to offer to you as well. Consider that reverse mentoring too. Next question is, how does each generation like to be recognized? And a lot of that goes back to what their values are. So, for example, the traditionalists, they believe that hard work brings rewards. So just mentioning that what they have done is of value and has an impact on the organization, that can reward them. Boomers tend to be more materialistic, I think, than many of the other generations. They like monetary rewards. They like incentivizing them to do a good job. The Gen X, they really expect you to include them, and making them a part of the process becomes part of the reward for them. They want to see results, so making sure you praise them when things are done well and telling them how the result impacted the organization is a good reward method for them. A good way to reward the millennials is with flexibility, particularly in scheduling. They don't want to be tied to a typical 9 to 5 schedule, so if you can reward them by letting them work different hours, perhaps work from home, things like that can be very motivational to the millennial generation. And quite honestly, I don't know that I have an answer for how to recognize Gen Z, because it is a new generation. They're just now really entering the workforce, but my best guess would be kind of the same way you would motivate and recognize the millennials. Give them a little bit of autonomy. Again, make sure that you are not talking down to them and praising them for their contributions. The next question, would you recommend having an open conversation about the different generations at a staff meeting, or would that open a can of worms? I think that open conversation for just about anything is a good idea. I think that asking your staff in a staff meeting, what did they think their most important traits are from their own generational perspective is. I mean, maybe go over just a little bit of I've gone over in this presentation about the different traits of each generation, and then ask them to self-identify. I know a lot of people don't necessarily identify with the generation that best fits their year of birth. So using that discussion and opening that up, where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself more like a millennial? Do you see yourself more as a Gen Xer? I don't think it would open up a can of worms at all. I think having an open dialogue and asking your staff to share where they think they are, how they prefer to be communicated with, all of those things can really do nothing but increase um, your effectiveness in the workplace. What do you see as the best trait of the millennials? In my experience working with some millennials, I think that they are very hard workers. I think that they have a lot of the traits of the boomer and traditionalist generation. It's been said that generations tend to start repeating themselves, and I can see that in the millennials that I work with, and I work with quite a few either as my customers or my coworkers. I think they're very dedicated. Um, they do have kind of a different outlook about where and when they should work in some cases, because they do know that they can work from just about anywhere for some of them. If you don't have to interact with other people as part of your job, for example, if you were in a customer service role, you may not have to show up at an office at 8 o'clock in the morning. But I think the millennials are very hardworking, very dedicated, and they bring a lot of great ideas into the workforce. What other questions do we have? I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. All right, I have missed a few. Let me just come back here. Shouldn't employees adapt? Oh, I did that one. I'm so sorry. I did get that one. One of the things that I really just want to reiterate to everyone is, even though generations have different traits, different communication methods, I really think it's most important that you realize that we have more in common than we are different. And each generation has things that it can offer within the workplace. If you think about it in terms of those of you who have children, especially grown children, you've probably learned something from them. And just because you're older than someone else doesn't mean they don't have something to teach you. Being open to communicating in different ways can make you more effective in your communication style. And understanding that even though we're different, we really are all just human beings, and we have a lot more in common than we have in differences. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate everyone coming today, and I hope you learned some methods for communicating with different generations. And thank you for attending, and please plan to attend future webinars for United Partners for Human Services. Thank you so much.